Hello, I'm Dr. Diane Leslie Webster, and my story today is A Life Remembered. It's the story of the life of my great uncle, my grandfather's brother, Lieutenant Colonel Robert MW Webster, or Uncle Bert as I knew him. The story starts back in 1964, when I was just 8 years old. 1964, Greenvale, Victoria. Uncle Bert and Auntie Ethel are visiting Granny and Grandpa today, my mother said as we drove through the Dunhellen gates and up the long gravel drive to the big bluestone mansion where my grandparents live. Hello, little girl. What's your name? Uncle Bert said to me, kindly, for the second time in less than 15 minutes. I had told him my name was Diane already. Why was he asking me again? I went into the kitchen to help Granny with the lunch preparations. Don't mind Uncle Bert, Diane. His memory has gone now. He was a doctor in the war, my grandmother told me quietly. After lunch, I heard Auntie Ethel, Uncle Bert's wife, talking to Granny while we were doing the dishes. Bert is such a worry for me, Eileen. He doesn't sleep at night and just wanders off in the dark and gets lost. I have to follow him out and bring him home. He just doesn't remember anything now. 1973, first year medicine, Monash University. Has anyone in your family been a doctor before? A fellow student asked me. No, there's only me. Oh, except my great-uncle Bert, my grandfather's brother. He was a doctor in the war, World War II, I think, but he lost his memory. Years later, I decided to research the life of Dr. Robert MW Webster, who died in 1968, just 5 years before I began my own medical training at Monash University. He was the first person in our family line to study medicine and spend his life caring for others as a doctor. Robert MW Webster was born on July 20, 1889 in Caulfield, Victoria. He was the eldest son of Joe Webster and Annie Marriott. Joe had decided to try his luck in Australia and at the age of 19 sailed on the Clyde, which left Gravesend, England on July the 6th, 1882, arriving in Sydney many months later on May the 8th, 1883, with just 10 shillings in his pocket and a lot of hope. Joe was the seventh child of 13 and left his family behind back in Bethnal Green in London. Joe met Annie when he offered to paint the front fence of Councillor Robert Marriott's house in Caulfield. Annie was Robert's eldest daughter of 14 children, 5 of whom had died in infancy. Robert Marriott later went on to be the Mayor of St Kilda, and Joe and Annie were married on August 22nd, 1888 at St Mary's, Caulfield, with a big celebration afterwards at the St Kilda Town Hall. Annie decided she was not going to have a big family like her mother. Annie had been a mother to most of her younger brothers and sisters for years before she married Joe. No, she intended to have 2 children at the most. Bert was born in 1889 and Les, my grandfather, followed soon after in 1891. So that was it. No more children. Annie's father, Robert Marriott, set Joe up in the hardware business in Caulfield, and Joe started a successful hardware company in Glen Huntly Road, Elstonwick, known as Webster's Timber and Hardware, providing hardware and contractor tradies for the local building industry. Annie and Joe wanted a good education for both their sons and sent them to Caulfield Grammar, where they were part of the School Cadet Corps and received the best school education available in Melbourne at the time. The family lived at Luxborough in Black Rock, named after the street Joe once lived in, Bethnal Green, in London. Bert matriculated in 1906 and started his medical degree at Melbourne University. Les later went on to Dookie College near Shepparton, Victoria, to study agricultural science. Dookie is now a part of Melbourne University. Bert graduated MBBS, Bachelor of Medicine and Bachelor of Surgery, from Melbourne University in 1912 and worked in rotations throughout Melbourne city hospitals. When the First World War broke out on the 28th of July 1914, Bert felt it was his duty to sign up. He was 26 when he enlisted on October the 1st, 1915, and left Australia from Sydney on board HMAT, that is, His Majesty's Australian transport ship, the Persic, which sailed on the 30th of May 1916 for France. Bert joined the 10th Australian Field Ambulance in France as captain. There's very little in Bert's military records describing the detail of what he experienced during the war. I just can't imagine the horrors he must have seen over there and had to deal with as a surgeon and physician. Amputations performed under minimal anaesthesia, infections with no antibiotics to treat them, mustard gas causing burns and blindness, blast injuries. The doctors would be working hard and fast with very little time to attend to their own needs. According to his service records, he did get some short periods of leave, however, during the years of the war, 1914 to 1918. When he was granted leave, he could go to his Uncle William's house in Essex. His Uncle William was his father Joe's oldest brother, William James. While Bert was taking a little rest during his leave, he was kept company by his cousin, Ethel Violet, who was Uncle William's youngest daughter and still living in the family home. Bert was awarded the Military Cross on the 20th of October 1917, which was awarded to a British or Commonwealth officer for displaying exemplary gallantry for an act or acts performed during active service. He was promoted to Major following this award. At the end of World War I, Bert went back to Essex to recuperate at his uncle's home and spent more time with Ethel. Bert and Ethel, who were first cousins, married on the 10th of October 1918. Together, they sailed back to Australia to make a new life. He was 29 years old and she was 23. They decided to settle in Campbelltown, Tasmania. A general practitioner was needed to serve the large rural area in central Tasmania. Ethel gave birth to 3 children in quick succession: John, 1920, David, 1921, and Betty, 1923. Bert and Ethel both decided 3 was enough, since both their parents had come from very large families with all their inherent troubles. Bert found his war surgical experience invaluable as a country GP and confidently managed a wide range of conditions from delivering babies to dealing with accidents and infections. He was a GP in Campbelltown from 1919 until 1940, more than 20 years. He was a quiet man after the war and didn't really engage with his family and his own children very much. They were largely left to their own devices, and he devoted himself to his practice of medicine. It must have helped him to block out the vivid memories of war that likely followed him everywhere. The world was at war again by September 1939. Bert was 50 years old now and would have easily justified not re-enlisting due to his age and the need for his services for the central Tasmanian people. But he was somehow drawn back in again to the vortex of war. Was it a weird form of Stockholm syndrome where people who have been taken hostage and who suffer a traumatic situation at the hands of their captors start to befriend their kidnappers and want to join them and do not want to be released? Bert closed his medical practice in Campbelltown and re-enlisted at Launceston on the 23rd of August 1940. He joined the 2 9 Australian Ambulance Corps as Major RMW Webster and was sent to Singapore Island for the war against Japan. Less than a year later, he was promoted to Lieutenant Colonel on the 1st of August 1941. His wife Ethel moved to Newstead, Launceston for the duration of the Second World War years while Bert was away. Their oldest son John, now 40, had moved to Hawthorn in Melbourne years before to work for the CSIRO as an entomologist. David had earlier moved to Queensland for his work, and Betty, now 37, had married and settled in Box Hill, Melbourne. Ethel didn't hear much about where Bert was stationed during World War II or what was happening. From his military records, I found he was reported missing for weeks following the fall of Singapore in February 1942. Then he was reported in March 1942 as an interred prisoner of war of the Japanese on Singapore Island. In January 1943, he was transferred by the Japanese to the Malayan prisoner of war camp. He was the commanding officer of the Australian POWs in one of the toughest camps in World War II. The Australian and New Zealand POWs were sent out each day for heavy manual labour to build the Burma Railway. The Japanese had decided to build the notorious 415-kilometre railway from Burma to Thailand in order to transport arms and supplies and soldiers to aid their war effort throughout Southeast Asia. Bert looked after his men as best he could, but they were all malnourished and infected with diseases such as cholera, malaria, tropical ulcers. The building of the Burma Railway took the lives of more than 12,000 prisoners of war in total, including 2,700 Australians. After the defeat of the Japanese and the end of World War II, Bert was recovered from the Malayan camp on the 31st of August 1945 with the other remaining prisoners of war who had managed to survive. He was transferred back to Perth Military Hospital, initially with severe malnutrition. The men were simply walking, staggering skeletons after their ordeal in the Malayan camp. Bert was transferred back to Melbourne in November 1945 and spent the next 8 months recovering at Heidelberg Repatriation Hospital. He didn't like to talk about the war. In mid-1946, he and Ethel moved to a house in Box Hill after his discharge to be close to their daughter Betty. Bert seemed to be just listless, according to Ethel. Who knows what traumas he had experienced and seen perpetrated on his fellow man? We can only imagine. Bert could never get back to practicing medicine after the Malayan internment camp and took an early retirement. Ethel said he liked to read in the early years after his return. Then he just stopped reading because he said he couldn't concentrate on anything. He started taking long walks every day. Soon he started to get lost on his walks, and when he wasn't back by dinner time, Ethel would go out in her car and search for him until she found him. Bert suffered through 9 years in the midst of active war, performing at a high level as an officer and military surgeon. 4 years of World War I when he was 26, and then 5 years of World War II when he was aged between 50 and 55. It took its toll. Bert died peacefully in the Heidelberg Repatriation Hospital on the 24th of July 1968. He was 79 years old. For the last 20 years of his life, his memory deteriorated until by the time of his death, he couldn't remember who he was or what he had done in his life. He did not recognize his loved ones. This story is my humble gift to the memory of a great man who lived one life, the life of Lieutenant Colonel Robert MW Webster. Thanks for taking the time to listen to Bert's story. Please subscribe to my channel on YouTube and feel free to click the like icon and leave a comment. Until next time.